You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans and special guests, as told to Mayor Emanuel.
This is Mayor Emanuel, Chicago Stories. We're here with author Alex Kotlowitz, who just wrote An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. Also famous for The Other Side of the River, and There Are No Children Here, which was the big kind of...
Right.
Do you see these two as one continuum?
I see them as kind of bookends, yeah.
Yeah? What got you then to write An American Summer?
So, when I wrote There Are No Children Here, this came out in 1991, and one of the, I spent these 2 years with these two boys in the Henry Horner Homes, the public housing complex, used to be on the near west side, and one of the underlying elements of their life was the constant violence, and as bad as it is now, was considerably worse then.
Right.
But I think what's for me has been really unsettling and distressing is the stubborn persistence of the violence, and over the years I've just seen what it's done to kind of shape the spirit of both individuals and community, and that's what I wanted to try to get at in this book.
One of the things I have found as mayor, I don't want to say I made a habit, but I made a practice as recently as this week, where I've called, visited, I don't tell anybody about it, parents or parent who's lost a child or had a child as a victim in hospitals, at their home. I am sometimes blown away. I mean, I say this to you as a father, not a journalist, and me as a father, not a mayor. I would be wrapped around the axle.
Right.
I don't know if I could get up. I'm always in awe of the fortitude of mainly mothers, but their ability to keep moving.
Right.
You write about this word called complex loss,
Right.
and compassionate relief. Explain what you mean by it.
Right.
I think that was scratching at the same...
I agree. I'm in awe of a lot of the people I met during the course of working on this book. That the stories all differ, but there are a number of stories of people who have lost people really close to them, a child, a loved one. And this capacity not only to kind of stand erect in this world that's slumping around you, and some of them, what you forget is, they still, for some of the moms, they still have other kids, they've got a husband, they've got a job, and there's this necessity to do that. But I think what we can't neglect is the fact that that single act of violence, it gets in your bones. It takes something from you. And I feel like that's the part of this that we haven't really attended to.
What do you mean by that?
That people are experiencing these traumas. One of the things that's striking to me is how many people have experienced the violence either as a victim or somebody around them, right, and are unable or unwilling or discouraged from talking about it. And so it just builds and builds inside, and there's this utter sense of loneliness. And that's what I mean. That's like, for example, this program at Ready, for me, what's so interesting about that is they're having these sessions with group therapy sessions. So these guys are all doing this together and kind of learning from each other.
Gang members, you mean, or victims? Or when you say
the young men who have had, for whatever reason, have had to run into troubles and may be apt to, get angry easily. And so they sit around there and they say, that's me. I get really angry really easily, or I can't sleep, or I'm really anxious, or I'm smoking a lot of marijuana because it's the only thing that calms me down. And so they begin to realize that it's not unique to who they are. It's part of what I think how we sort of deal with veterans returning from combat, right? That you want to let them know that, one, they're not alone in their experience, that what they're experiencing is completely natural, and then sort of figure out the coping mechanisms that they can learn to.
Between the two books, There Are No Children Here, which emerges, and then An American Summer. One was when there was public housing. Today, not housing in that traditional sense of the warehousing. When you wrote about 1991, we were having
950 homicides.
Yeah. We're on track. We're about to report February, so I don't want to, but it's down significantly by almost half. The last 2 years by 30%, and now it's still continuing. Yet it feels more prevalent, even though before it was, as you just said, 950, and yet there are no public housing.
Right.
Why do you think it feels more prevalent?
Right.
And I have that's a leading question, so it's like a soft one for you here. But why do you think that is?
Yeah, you're right.
There's a big difference.
Right. Well,
Henry Horner up and Henry Horner down.
Right. Well, there are a couple of differences, but you're right that the violence now, while the numbers are nowhere near what they were 25 years ago, yet somehow it feels as intense, if not more intense than it did then. And I think there are two reasons. I think one, back then, most of the violence occurred in public housing, and so it was really out of sight, out of mind. I mean, those were places that nobody went into, and I mean nobody.
Yeah, nobody went to Cabrini Green, Taylor, Henry Horner.
Including people from my profession, fellow journalists. But the other part of it is, the gangs have broken apart. I mean, it's kind of the unintended consequence of public policy. There was a decision in the 1990s to kind of cut the snake off at the head, and we are arrested and put in prison many of the gang leaders.
Right. Older.
Right. And as a result, the gangs broke apart. The police estimate now between 600 to 800 different cliques or crews, whatever you want to call them. And so the violence does feel much more random. It feels much more arbitrary. It's not, used to be around this very robust drug trade. It was very directed and purposeful, and that isn't the case now. But that's the only explanation I can think of, that and the fact that that when it was happening in public housing, it really was happening out of everybody's sight.
Yeah. I think there are three policies in the 90s that roll forward, 90s and early 2000, and then now come to bear. One is, and they're all, I could justify right for their own purpose, but then when you put them together, created a combination. One was taking down the public housing.
Right.
And not providing services to the residents who took vouchers. And you can't take somebody from Robert Taylor, put them in South Shore, and wait for a new housing and assume that all the other behaviors that came with Robert Taylor, I'm slightly passing judgment, go with them rather than stop. Two, like you said, the gang leadership was taken out. So you have these kids at 16, 18, 19 who have a different attitude than a person who's running a business at 32. And you have a lot more conflict where the police were set up to fight, get between the disciples and the vice lords. But when the vice lords turned on the vice lords, they weren't really structured to figure out how to interdict. Then the third piece of it, in a lot of the communities in the city of Chicago, South Shore, Chatham, etc., when you eliminated 10,000 public sector jobs, here in our city, you have to, if you work for the city, you got to live in the city. You pull out of a neighborhood a stabilizing factor, which is a middle-class African-American family with a public sector job, and replace it with somebody out of Robert Taylor. And you put those three things together, which were happening in silos but simultaneously, that becomes a combination where the violent is more, I don't know what you think about that. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all reasonable.
They're factors.
Yeah, and I do think like the transformation plan, which was this kind of bold, audacious plan, to tear down all the high rises when anybody spent time in them, it should have been torn down a long time ago. But it was, I think, a really kind of a missed opportunity on two fronts. I think you're right. I mean, they took people out. They did the easy part really quickly. They tore down the high rises and scattered people to the winds, and without any effort and no support. And what's more, it was this missed opportunity to at least have a conversation in the city about integration, about residential racial integration. I mean, that's what the history of public housing is so much about. Racial segregation, these kind of bulwarks to dividing blacks and whites in the city. And when they tore them down, there was all this talk about, creating these mixed income communities, but no talk about mixed race communities.
When you went to journalism, did you see yourself, at the end of the day, leaving journalism to write two books? Not that you're not consider yourself still a journalist, but this would be a topic or a subject that would grab you like this? Well, sounds like it, and that hasn't let go of you.
Yeah. No, when I was at, I spent 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, but even when I was at the Journal, I was hired to cover organized labor and these industrial companies. I was terrible at business reporting, and so I was able to.
I'm so glad you see Chicago Stories as a confessional moment, Alex.
But I was able to sneak my way into, creating this, where I just wrote about urban affairs and social policy. So even when I was at the Journal, I wrote about this. I think for me, the thing that drives me is just this notion that life ought to be fair. And so I find myself writing about these moments, these places, when life just doesn't seem particularly fair or just.
But the subject, though, seems to be like, I don't want to say, I'm not your therapist here, but obsession, almost like you can't shake it.
It has
There's
been,
other ways just to describe unfairness. This seems to be the one that grabbed you.
Right. Well, it has been in part, There Are No Children Here, was this full immersion for these 2 years in this community, and out of it emerged all these friendships and relationships, and which have really influenced and affected me over time. So there's no question about it. I mean, it's not all I write about, but yeah, I feel strongly that, well, this is one of the things that feels unjust and unfair, is this great inequity in our cities.
I capture this, some people think, they hope when their kids grow up and et cetera, they'll come back and move next to them or near them, or right. People that grow up around poverty, they want to escape it and never see it again, not come back and do so. Now, I shouldn't say that, but like Jamal Cole, who I've had on here, he's gone back to say, I'm going to make it different than that. But it's a different mindset. And there's a sense of being trapped by all that's wrong. You say you don't have the solutions, or they're not fully apparent. Yet, short of being a criminologist, you have studied one subject exhaustively. If you were to, okay, let me do it this way. You have a magic wand.
I don't have a magic wand.
Okay, but I'm giving you one.
And I'm glad I'm not mayor.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
I have a theory of the case.
So,
what would you say so people don't lose hope?
Right. So let me just say this up front. You say I've studied the situation, but I really think of myself as a storyteller. And for me, what I'm really interested in are the personal stories of people who are somehow, I mean, much of my work are people who are somehow struggling and somehow emerge from that standing upright, usually, hopefully. So, look, I'd be disingenuous if I didn't tell you there are things I think that ought to be done. I mean, one of the things that's clear to me in the 25 years or so between these two books is that the neighborhoods that I write about are as distressed, if not more so, than they were then. And so clearly, one of the things, it's no accident that most of the violence occurs in these neighborhoods that are profoundly poor, communities in which there's not much sense of future or sense of hope. I always remember there was a former World Bank economist, Paul Collier, who wrote this book, The Bottom Billion, that was about, he wrote it about the developing world, and it was about the kind of what he saw as a cycle of violence. And what he saw was that there was a cycle of violence in parts of the world where there was this profound poverty against this extraordinary wealth. And so my first thing is to somehow figure out a way to provide both opportunity and also to fortify these communities.
But you also say in the book, this is really not just a story of Chicago. I mean, it's a story you're familiar with. This is a story of any city. And you're talking about restoring hope where despair is prevalent. So, I mean, I kind of take it we're not the only city in America, let alone the world, with despair, but the access to guns is a portion of this. All the other kind of breakdowns, not just of economic, but family and community, that then feed on itself and have a virtuous...
but families break down because of the burden that is on their shoulders, right?
I totally get that.
And I would agree with you that in the end, I mean, family is the most essential institution out there. And so, but it's also the hardest institution for public policy to reckon with. And so I think you've got to figure out the way I think you fortify family by fortifying community. Okay.
You and I think last saw each other, if I'm not mistaken, at a BAM. You said we talked with some of the young men. I kind of see that as the Becoming a Man initiative as helping young men see a lot of what their potential is, which they don't get reinforced a lot of times.
Look, there's some wonderful programs out there. I mean, there's Becoming a Man. There's the Heartland Alliance's Ready program, where they're going out and providing both employment and cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, there's the kind of street intervention that's taking place around the city. There's a lot of good work going on out there, but that in and of itself is not going to solve the problem.
No, this is one problem that doesn't lend itself to a singular. So you have to come in at multi-levels and different fronts. Gun access, law enforcement.
The gun access is a significant one, and of course the conservatives all make the argument, but Chicago's got such strict gun laws, and look at what happens even then. But of course, as you well know, I mean, all you need to do is cross the border into Indiana, and it's
I always tell people, give me your order, I'll have it back in your hands in 30 minutes, I'll have 2 of it. So you can.
I mean, the fact that the police take off 7,000 to 10,000 guns off the street every single year is just, I mean, how can you turn your eye to that? So,
I actually... One thing, and I don't know what you think, but I mean, the truth is, I mean, you say a child in Englewood sees the promise of what an incredible city is close. To me, in the end of the day, the fundamentals are about education.
Yeah, but I'd be a little, I mean, I would agree on some level. Education is sort of the myth in this country is that education is the institution that you can transcend your place in society, right? But the truth of the matter is those kids walk into that school building every day, and it's not like they leave behind everything that's weighing down on them. And so I think one of the mistakes we make in talking about school reform is the idea that if we provide the best teachers and the best resources and the newest buildings, that we're going to make a difference in the lives of these kids. If we do nothing else in their communities and with their and to fortify their families, it's not going to make a difference in the classroom. And one of the things I would argue about is that I feel we've placed much too much of a burden on our teachers. We don't have enough social workers in our schools.
I agree. I mean, look, here's the thing. So we can have a debate about this, and this was my theory, which is you have intervention and you have prevention. And I've, through both BAM, after school, summer jobs, full day kindergarten, full day pre-K, double, triple down on the prevention side to prevent another generation. And there's no doubt you're asking correctly out of social workers, more out of the schools. I agree with you. No one teacher, which is why I think the whole thing is upside down. I wrote about this in Atlantic. No one teacher can handle in 50 minutes everything that's coming through that door.
Right.
But we're asking more and more of our public sector to support the families appropriately. Some of that's social workers, some of that's more time in school, but that school is still a place of tranquility. But here's my other point, which is if you went to prison today, and why education is transformative, and I would double down on that argument, overwhelming amount of people in those prisons are men of color between the ages of 19 and 35 without a high school degree. And the only factor you can change is a high school degree from a public policy standpoint. And because when you get a high school degree, you have a tomorrow you can live for. When you don't, you don't, and you're going to do something really crazy.
Well, I would argue there's more that we can do. I mean, one, for example...
There's always more, but it's one thing that guaranteed that if you do can change the trajectory.
Right, but we're also, for a country that likes to think of ourselves as a forgiving place, you come out of prison with a felony on your record, you're marked for the rest of your life. And so it's extraordinarily difficult, to find...
I have the largest sex offender. I agree with you. That's why we've done the second...
I'm not saying...
We're having a discussion about it. I agree with you. But that's on the back end when something happened. I'm saying, how do you stop it on the front end? And that high school degree or that education is really a relevant factor.
Right.
And the school is a place, I wouldn't say it can leave behind, but can create some tranquility in a child's young man's life.
Right, and I would agree with that. One of the myths is that I spent some time at Harper High, and one of the things that's clear is that these are places where kids want to be. It's a place of respite and refuge, as you suggest. But again, if we do nothing else in the lives of these kids and their families, it's going to be really hard. And one of the things I would argue is because of the violence, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for kids who have experienced the violence either firsthand or losing somebody close to them, for them to focus and concentrate. And
we couldn't do it. And the assumption that somebody else could is impossible. What other cities have you gone to? Chicago is kind of the one that grabbed you?
Well, Chicago's where this is. I live in Oak Park. This is I think of this as my home. I'm a New Yorker by birth, but an accidental Chicagoan. So this is the place I've chosen to write about. But you're right. I could have done this book in Baltimore and New Orleans and Detroit. It's not particular to Chicago. And as violent as Chicago is, it's not even in the top 10 most violent cities in the country. But it is the place that everybody sort of looks at.
Give me a sense of you have about 20 people you focus on. Talk about them and what they meant to you.
Right. Yeah, so I think I counted there are 14 stories in the book, and they're, these very intimate stories. And what I was looking for were stories that somehow surprised me or knocked me off balance. So there's a story, they've all stayed with me. There's a story of Lisa Daniels, whose son, she's this wonderful, incredibly thoughtful woman, and she's got an older son who goes off to get his engineering degree at U of I, and her younger son strays and begins to get involved in selling drugs. And she does everything she can, and he gets caught up in a drug deal that goes awry, and he ends up getting shot and killed. And the two parts of her story that just really knocked me off balance is one is when her son is killed, the newspaper reports are all about his past criminal life. And she knows that there's more to him than just that. It's not that she is in denial about what he's done, but she knows that he's a much fuller, richer, complex person than that.
Is that where complex loss comes from?
Well, complex loss is really about sort of having this loss and having it in a place where you can't find any comfort because it's just going to appear and reappear again. So this notion, it's like you think about soldiers who come back from Vietnam or excuse me, from Afghanistan or Iraq.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to translate that for you later.
Thanks. And once they come back home, they're physically removed from that violence. You live in a community like Englewood and you lose a friend, you still, the next day, you're looking over your shoulder and,
How's it affected you?
Working on this book took its toll. I mean, there's this notion of secondary trauma where you sort of experience trauma kind of almost vicariously. And given, I almost hesitate to talk about it because whatever I experience is so minimal given what others have. But one of the things that I found is interesting working on this book, I didn't like talking with people about the stories, about what I was working on. And it was also the case with the people I spoke to, that it was really hard for them to talk about this moment in their life.
To me, I don't know about you, but I find the senselessness of it. And then I'm somewhat in awe of the way the family, at least outwardly, is still spiritual and still putting one foot in front of the other, where I could not do it.
No, I agree. And the other element in all this, of course, is this incredible and earned distrust of the justice system, from the police on upwards. And so if I had a magic wand, one of the first things I would do is sort of figure out why it is that we are unable to solve violent crimes in this city. What's at work there? I mean, last year it was roughly 25%, which means you got a pretty good chance of getting away with murder in Chicago. Or even worse, it's only 1 out of 10 shootings that are solved. I would say
to you, having now spent 8 years of my life on this one, I think you said when you said the criminal justice, we talk about the police piece. We don't deal with the courtroom or the lack of, or the certainty around certain things. And folks, certain elements feel like they're going to bring certainty around the penalties associated with it. And that's why they are going to take the law somewhat into their own hand. And that's a portion of this problem.
I'm not sure I follow. So who?
I think that I don't think a lot of people have a respect for the judges.
Right.
And they think that if they spend time working with the rest of law enforcement, they're going to see the person back on the street in 6 months. So when you say the criminal justice system, I just would not leave it, the distrust just to police. It goes all the way up to the lawyers, prosecutors, public defenders, the judges, and there's a big gap there.
Right. It does, but I think for me that,
that's a piece of it.
Right, and I just want to back up and say that one of the mistakes I think we make is thinking that this is a police problem, and it isn't, and it puts a undue burden on the police, and it's partly what creates this tension. But the other part of it is this sort of inability, for whatever reason, for the police to do what seems to me a fundamental task, which is to solve crimes. And so when that happens, if you live in a community like that, you begin to lose a sense of confidence.
Look, I use this anecdote 2 months ago, 11th District on the west side. A woman turned to the police and said, that car over there has guns and those guys are... Now, 5 years ago, she never would have done that. Now, I don't want to overemphasize it, but she's now decided that her safety is aligned with the police rather than her fear of the gangs, and her safety's there. And I think that talks about the transformation, but I agree with you. If the police are not trusted, it is hard to kind of create the public safety and prevention you want to see of crime. But I would argue also there's a lack of trust with the rest of the criminal justice system as well, and that's a contributing factor. And the problem is we put the entire debate and onus just on one element of it.
Right.
And that's not fair in my view, or accurate if you're trying to solve it. Have you looked at other cities? Besides, I know you're in Chicago. No.
No, I mean, have I looked at them? I've looked at them, and I've spent a little time reporting other places. But this is, And again, I'm not. I mean, I was very explicit with this book at the very beginning that this was not a book about public policy. I didn't want. It's not my forte. I didn't want to write about public policy, and I felt too that if I did, in a year or two, it would feel outdated. That I really wanted to write a book that felt as intimate as I could with the people whose lives are so directly impacted by
Beyond,
violence.
I think you said, was it Lisa Daniels? What her name?
Right.
Who else?
Well, I want to finish the Lisa Daniels story real quick. So,
sure. I
so
apologize for
that's okay.
interrupting.
No, so her son is, her son is shot in this drug deal gone awry, and two things happened. One is that Lisa, she posts on Facebook just about sort of who Darren, her son name was Darren Easterling, who Darren was, and just to sort of let people know that he was more than just this convicted criminal. And for me, it speaks widely because I think one of the things you see often when somebody's shot, the first thing you hear is so-and-so was a gang member or had a convicted record, and you lose sight of who they were. So that was the first part of it. The other part of it that was, for me, the most amazing part of her story is that, in the end, she finds a way to forgive the person who shot her son. And she comes to see that the lines were blurred, that it could just easily been her son who shot this small-time drug dealer. It could just as easily been the other way. And she's now, created this, began this correspondence with this guy in prison.
So when Cleo Pendleton came to me and she said she wanted to start a not-for-profit to help train people so people wouldn't feel like they could just shoot, I said, I don't know if I would have the charity of my soul that my time and energy post something happened to my child would be about the person that perpetuated the crime, rather than that to me.
No, she's an amazing woman. She's now
there's a grace there.
Yeah, there is a grace, and there's a kind of strength, and for her, it really wasn't about forgiveness. It was about justice, about what felt just. And she's actually now. She just took a job on the state parole board, and I suspect will have an influence on how they think about.
Anybody else besides her?
One of the other stories, so many of the stories stayed with me, but the story of Eddie Bocanegra. And Eddie is somebody who at the age of 18 lost a friend, and a friend was shot and paralyzed, and Eddie ends up seeking revenge and ends up shooting and killing somebody and serves 12 years. And his is a story about trying to find a way to forgive himself. And he's not only emerged from this, but he's just dedicated his life to trying to do what he can to undo some of the wreckage that he was a part of. He's the one who actually runs this program, this READY program that I mentioned at Heartland Alliance. But he's a remarkable individual.
I always tell people that a lot of these individuals in another life would have been a hedge fund trader or would have been a lawyer or a doctor. I mean, they're unbelievably capable, but for a host of reasons, they went down one path rather than the other. And that's not true of everybody, but it is true of a bigger share.
Right, but it's not. I want to be careful here, though. Don't you think? I mean, it's not. The people make choices, but people's choices feel incredibly limited. So I want to be careful that this is not just in my mind, it's not just a question of people making the right or wrong choice, but it seems to me that as a country, the great paradox of this country is we're this great generosity beside such neglect. And these neighborhoods, these communities have been terribly neglected. And you look at the history, I think of Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on the case for reparations they did in the Atlantic about sort of why it is that blacks in this country have been unable to build up equity, which had everything to do with the sort of unwillingness to sell homes to blacks. And so I think we have to remind ourselves that there's a history here. It's why this city is so deeply segregated. It's why these communities, these impoverished communities, feel so isolated from the rest of the city. So I think, I guess all I'm saying is that you're right, the choice is important here, personal choice, but to also understand the context of why people make the choices.
Well, I say that, sitting in that chair a while ago, well, there's a guy right now who's like number 4 in the CTA, but he started in the ex-offender program. And I asked him the question, and I said, what's the difference between you? And he says, I made a choice. And once you make that choice, I actually think as a society, we owe you the responsibility that you can get you on the right path.
Right.
But I don't think you can eliminate, and I'm not saying, I don't disagree with you, that some of these neighborhoods can actually limit choice or constrain it. But you can't totally take out of the equation choice and individual will and act.
Of course not. And,
Right.
and people need
because
to be
that
held,
would be a mistake.
right, of course. People need to be held accountable for
Right.
what they do. But I just think there also has to be an acknowledgement that, look, it's no accident that the violence, if you look at the map of,
Right.
of homicides, it's like a thunderstorm is kind of hurled through the south and west sides of the city and missed every other part of
No,
the
it's the,
city. And what do they all have in common? These are all communities that are in one manner or another
felt abandoned
felt abandoned, distressed
for years,
yeah,
decades.
yeah.
So I had the police department take a look at this. Our deaths or violence by stabbing is no different than New York or LA.
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is guns. And while I think police have a piece of this, economics has a piece of this, intervention, prevention, et cetera, family, I believe, et cetera. And I want to ask one more question is, gun control won't solve everything.
Right.
The real difference is we have Indiana and Wisconsin.
Right.
New York has New Jersey and Connecticut. And I always say, give us New Jersey, Connecticut gun laws.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So as a mayor,
Hey, this is my podcast, dude.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see if you get a question. Go ahead.
So, but
Well,
I agree with you totally about the guns. I
Yeah.
mean,
Access
it makes me so. In the wake of Newtown and Parkland, we're asking all the right questions. One of which is, what do we do about this
Right.
incredible availability of guns? We don't ask that enough in a place like Chicago. So, as a mayor, what can you do? Or is this really a problem that we need to deal on a national
No, look, you
level?
cannot. Chicago does have tough gun laws.
Right.
But the fact is, there are 3 gun shops in Cook County that
Right.
provide an overwhelming amount. And Indiana, I mean, Illinois is 40 of the 60%. So, last year, the Chicago police took 9,600 guns off the street. It's a gun an hour. Right now, only January and February, we're on pace to outpace the highest year of retrieving guns. So there's no limit. We're outpacing it by, ready? 30%. Does that mean by the end of December it will be that? But we are outpacing the highest year a gun an hour by 30%. Just sitting here, and we'll report the end of February results tomorrow morning. So that's just one way to understand it. So I do think, look, we're adding 1,000 officers and trying to train them in a different way to be more preventive.
Right.
So that's one. I have, through after school, summer jobs, and BAM, doubled down, so you don't spread the peanut butter thin, on prevention.
Right.
There is a whole piece of this that's about intervention, men who are basically cut off educationally, economically from participating. I'm just giving you my
But I guess my question more specifically is, and I'm not blame. I just I mean this is
I was trying to explain to you. I wasn't taking it.
No,
Did it have a
but
tinge of guilt associated?
No. But this is not an honest question. I just, as a mayor, is there anything that a mayor can do vis-a-vis gun control, or is it really a national issue?
You can do certain things in the state, but in the end of the day, as the person that was assigned by Clinton to do both the Brady Bill and the assault weapon ban, there's a reason you need national laws,
because of Indiana and Wisconsin.
It's real.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
basically, I always tell people, and I really believe this, you give me your order, I'll be back in 35 minutes, and I'll get you 2 of everything. You can keep 1 and sell 1. And it's not hard.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it's beyond not hard.
Right.
Now, the good news, we have a new governor. He's done some stuff. But at the end of the day, you need a national legislation that set one set of rules.
Yeah.
And, everybody talks about mental health, but in all due respect, take the case of Aurora. There's people being fired in France. There's people being laid off in France. They don't immediately go to a gun. They don't have this because the prevalent access, and that gets to a question I was going to ask you. How much of this do you think is random, and how much do you think of this is kind of premeditated? It was a spur of the moment.
Well, I think most of the violence in the city is spur of the moment. I mean, it's over reasonably petty disputes.
Yeah.
Somebody stepped on somebody's foot, or
Right.
there's some dispute between.
They thought they got ditched.
Right, or
Dissed, rather.
right. They did some out of disrespect. No, I think much of it is incredibly impulsive.
Yeah. There's there's a situation, I don't want to, this case of this poor young man, this high school student.
Oh,
It was
right, the
all
one,
about
yeah.
a gang sign. He happened to do a U-turn. They thought he was coming back at him. But what is a 17-year-old doing with that kind of a gun?
Right.
And, I mean, it's, you know, the one thing that kind of broke my spirits was I was visiting a young man in a hospital whose mothers did everything right, sent him, he went to a park district, went to participate in a basketball game, and a 13-year-old's walking around with a gun and taking shots. At what point, I mean, what is a 13-year-old having access to a gun?
Right. No, I agree.
Are you ready? Chicago rapid round. You'll get this. Okay? Yeah. Thick or thin pizza?
Thick.
So you really have left your New York roots.
I have.
Second, Cubs or Sox?
I'm not much of a baseball fan, but if you had to ask, I'd say the Cubs, but I'm not crazy about the politics of their owner.
Oh, well, you're not going out on a limb on this show. Sears or Hancock?
Oh, God. I'm not much of a high-rise guy, but I love the downtown.
Okay, but you can pick, you have to...
I have to pick one, Hancock.
Okay. River or lake?
Lake.
Okay. 16-inch, 12-inch softball?
16-inch.
You passed, man. You can officially say you're no longer a New Yorker.
Yeah, I played 16-inch. Yeah, no, I am no longer a
how
New
are your
Yorker.
fingers?
I tore a ligament in one of them. Yeah.
In a softball game?
Yeah, in a softball game. Yeah, quite a while ago, but yeah.
How old are your kids?
Are 24 and 21.
And are they in journalism? Are they in writing?
No, my son's still in college, and my daughter is working at part-time jobs at the moment. So.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Everybody good?
Yeah, everybody's good. Yeah, my wife is stressed. She works with immigrant kids, so she's in the mix of all this craziness. But yeah, things are good.
Well, so we have Alex Kotlowitz from An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. I don't know if I would say that 30 years later, but kind of a continuum of the conversation. There are no children here.
Right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, Alex. Thanks, man.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using #ShyStories. Thanks for listening.